Alright, so in today's video we're taking another look at this guy here. This is the Caddx Infra V2 night vision FPV camera. Now I did already do an initial review of this camera a couple of days ago. In that video I showed you me doing a unboxing, so you know exactly what it is you get for your money when you buy one of these. And then crucially in that video I showed you me testing this camera on one of my quadcopters in the middle of the night to kind of sort of show off what this camera is capable of and how well it can see in the dark. Now, I am pretty happy with that review. However, it was a little bit short and it wasn't exactly a detailed or comprehensive review. So that is why I'm now doing a part 2 review today. The goal of this video is to look at this camera in a lot more detail and to really put it through its paces. Now, it's become kind of traditional on my channel that when I review night vision cameras, I don't just install them on my drones and test them out in the air. I also install them directly onto a pair of my analog FPV goggles to basically make myself a pair of night vision goggles. And that's exactly what I've done again for today's video. These are a pair of my SkyZone Cobra X V2 analog FPV goggles. And as you can see, I've directly installed the Infra V2 camera onto them. Now, if you're interested in sort of copying this setup, I did do a video tutorial a couple of months ago where I showed how to install the Infra V1 camera onto this pair of goggles. And if you're interested in sort of copying this setup, I'll post the link down below to that tutorial because the setup is exactly the same for the Infra V2. Now, the benefit of installing the camera directly onto a pair of goggles like this, not only is it fun to kind of make your own sort of pair of night vision goggles, but it also allows me to just kind of test the camera in a lot more sort of situations without having to sort of like stress with sort of putting sort of drones in the air. And it doesn't mean I have to sort of rely on the weather to be good. So in today's video, I am going to be taking these goggles out. I'm going to test the camera in a whole load of sort of like different little lighting conditions and sort of like different environments and things like that. But later on in the video, I will also be doing some further drone testing, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So anyway, now I've explained that, let's head out to the field and let's start putting this camera through its paces to see what it's truly capable of. Let's go. Okay, so to kickstart my testing of the new Infra camera, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to test it in the middle of the day. Now I know that might seem like a little bit of a weird thing to do with this being a night vision camera. However, this camera should in theory be capable of being used in the daytime as well as the nighttime. And if you had this installed on one of your drones, you know, there may be occasions where maybe you want to fly it in the day. So that's why we're going to test it and see what it's like. Now, hopefully you can see it is the middle of a nice, bright, sunny day. It's the middle of summer, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You're never going to get brighter conditions than this. So let's now have a look and see what the Infra is like. I've got the goggles powered up and I've got the DVR recording. Let's now have a little bit of a look. And yeah, as you can see, you've got a perfectly usable image. Now, yes, this is a black and white image because this is a black and white camera. It can't do color at all. But if you can forgive that, as you can see, this is a perfectly usable image and you could fly with it. Now, admittedly, it's a little bit overexposed, especially if I look in the direction of the sky up towards the sun. It just appears completely white. But that doesn't really matter. The important thing is that as you look down sort of at the ground and at sort of details in the terrain around here, you can see everything pretty well. It's not a fantastic sort of optimal camera for being used in the daytime, but you could use it. I mean, imagine over here you've got a couple of goalposts there. Imagine like those are race gates and you're flying a race quad. You've got no problem seeing them. You could fly sort of through those goalposts absolutely no problem. So yeah, it's not a fantastic camera for being used in the day, but if you wanted to, you could use it. Now I think the thing to do next is to test this camera to see how well it performs in low light. And that's exactly what we're about to do now. Hopefully you can see in the background here, the sun has just set. It's set sort of around 15-20 minutes ago. So it's rapidly starting to get dark. We're very much entering that twilight phase. Now, the reason why I think it's important to kind of test the camera at this sort of time of the day is because, you know, not everyone that buys the Infra will necessarily want to fly in the dark, but they might be interested in flying at this time of day because, you know, say you've just finished work, this might be the only time of day that you have available to fly. So let's now put the goggles to my face and let's see what we can see with the camera in these lighting conditions. So as you can see, you've got a much more usable image compared to what I had during the middle of the day. You know, there's no issue with sort of massive exposure or overexposure in the sky. I can also look down at the ground and I can see all of the details absolutely fine. The camera is clearly working much, much better in these lower light conditions. Now I just want to show you over here. So I've got a tree here right beside me. And as you can see, you can clearly make out all of the details. You know, you can see all of the individual leaves here. And one thing I really want to point out, if I just step under the tree so we can have a bit of a closer look, is that you can make out all of the individual little branches. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because, you know, say you're flying a race quad and you're doing a little bit of proximity sort of around these trees,
You're not going to struggle with hitting ghost branches because the Infra V2, as you can see, can very clearly see all of them. So I think the takeaway is, at this point in the video, is that the Infra V2, you can use it in the daytime if you really want to, but it's not really ideal. If you want to use it at this time of day though, in the sort of the lower light time of day, twilight, golden hour kind of time of day, that's when this camera seems to work much, much better. Now obviously what you really want to know is how well does this camera perform in the dark. So let's fast forward a couple of hours into the middle of the night and let's find out how it performs. Let's go. Okay, so as you can see, it's now nighttime. Specifically, it's actually 11:31 p.m. And the reason why I mentioned the exact time to you is because this time of year in the Northern Hemisphere, with it being the middle of summer, you don't officially get nighttime. It never gets sort of completely dark. However, the darkest it gets is astronomical twilight. That's where it's sort of almost completely dark, but not quite. And an astronomical twilight officially started at 11:25. So yeah, it's now as dark as it's going to get. Now I'm currently at a location in a car park about, I don't know, about 5 miles away from the city, out on the edge of the woods here. The reason why I've chosen this location is just because obviously it's away from the city lights, then there's no sort of obvious light sources. In fact, the only light sources that we have here, so I don't know whether my GoPro's going to be able to see this, but it's a beautiful clear night sky. You can see all of the stars up there, there's not a single cloud in the sky. And if I just move over here, hopefully you'll be able to see in this gap in the trees. There is the moon. It's about a quarter moon at the moment. It's very low in the sky, but it is important that I just let you know that there is that there as a little bit of a light source. Just bear with me whilst I reposition my camera. So now that I've explained all of that, it's a nice sort of dark location. Let's now have a look in the goggles and see what the Infra V2 can see in these lighting conditions. I'll start off by turning off my phone torch so we don't have any illumination from that. Let's put the goggles to my face and let's see what we can see. So, as you can see, we can pretty much see absolutely everything. You can clearly make out the edge of the car park here. You can make out there's hedges all the way around the car park. You can make out there's trees there, trees here, looking in the other direction to make out there's trees there. You can clearly see my car, absolutely no issue seeing my car. You can see my hand as well, no issue. There's my GoPro. Now it does look like my GoPro is producing a lot of light. It looks very, very bright, but I promise you it's not. There's just a small screen on the front of the GoPro, which is obviously displaying the image the camera's seeing. However, the camera is only seeing black, so there's really not very much light being sort of broadcast by that screen, but because of the way the infra camera works, it just makes that look like a really, really bright light source. The electrics in my car are on, but there's no lights on. Just to prove that none of the lights are on, that's just the stereo lights. So yeah, it's basically pitch black here, but I mean, look at that. You've got no problem seeing my car at all. No problem seeing the trees here. And look at the night sky. Look at that. You can see all of the stars. There's thousands of them. It's amazing how many stars are around. It's amazing how well this camera can see the stars. You know, I do wonder whether this camera sort of potentially could have some applications in astronomy or stargazing. I wonder if you could like connect this camera to a telescope or something. It's amazing how many stars this camera is able to see. And yeah, look at the ground here as well. You know, you can clearly make out like the gravel on the ground here, the individual stones. And you make out these like the tire tracks here for cars that are sort of driven by here earlier on. It is incredible how well this camera can see. Now, a lot of people commented on my previous video about the infra. I also kind of mentioned it briefly as well. But there is one sort of slight issue with this camera. It's probably easier to demonstrate it if I look at the stars. There's a nice bright one there. So whilst the camera is completely still and we're looking at the stars there, you know, they look absolutely fine. But if I move the camera with a little bit of motion, do you notice how the stars there sort of streak a little bit? They're fine whilst the camera's still, but when I move it, they turn into streaks. And then, you know, obviously when I go back to being still, they come back. Just have a look at the ground. Tell here, you can sort of make out the gravel there quite sort of easily. If I move the camera, everything sort of becomes sort of quite smeary. You lose those details. Now, that's kind of an important thing to mention because, you know, if you're going to be using this camera on a drone which is moving quickly, its ability to see in the dark is sort of possibly going to be somewhat compromised. You know, you're still going to be able to make out sort of details like trees, but you're not going to get those fine details because they're all going to be smeared together. Basically, what I'm saying is that the Infra V2 camera is a very good night vision camera, but it's not going to be suitable, I don't think, for any kind of drone which is moving at high speed. Obviously, I can't say that for certain. Someone's going to need to try that, put it on drone and see how it performs. But based on what I'm seeing here, if your camera's moving too quickly, the details get very, very blurry. I think the way that this camera works, I don't know this for sure, but I think what the camera is basically doing is something called frame stacking. So when the camera is sort of in a fixed position looking at the ground, it's sort of probably taking multiple frames in quick succession, and it's kind of overlaying them, and that's allowing the camera to then kind of like enhance the image. But when the camera moves, those frames it takes in quick succession, it can't then overlay them together, and that's why you end up with this smeary sort of effect. Also, the kind of like the shutter speed of the camera is going to play a role in that, and like the ISO and things like that. But yeah, I think it's just important to mention about this smearing issue that we sort of see when the camera is moving. But anyway, now we've had a look at sort of how well this camera performs, out here in a reasonably dark location. What I want to do now is I want to try the camera in a really, really dark location. I want to try it in there. I want to go in the woods. Okay, so I've just moved position, so I'm now on the edge of the woods. I'm not even going to bother trying to use the GoPro because it's not going to be able to see anything. It's so much darker over here already. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the goggles to my face, and I'm just going to use my phone torch just for the moment, just so I can kind of sort of figure out where I'm going as I sort of walk in towards the woods here a little bit. And then once we're sort of very much underneath the canopy, I'll then put my phone torch away, and then literally there'll be no source of illumination here whatsoever. I don't imagine I'm going to need to walk very far into these woods. In fact, I might already try it now. Let's put the phone torch away. Okay, so yeah, it is now completely pitch black here. And yeah, this is a demonstration of what the Infra can see in an absolutely, completely pitch black location. Let's look back over towards my car. So obviously the car is sort of, it's not under the canopy. So that's being sort of, it's getting a little bit of illumination from the sky, I guess. But yeah, under here, as you can see, I'm very much under the canopy here, and it's pitch black. I should just mention there is a small red LED on the Infra, which is on top of my goggles. That is casting a little bit of illumination, which is what you're seeing illuminating those trees there. If I cover that with my hand, there you go, you can see that's got rid of that. So yeah, this is what the Infra can see in a completely pitch black location. There's pretty much no illumination here whatsoever. Little bit of light sort of managing to get through the trees there, but yeah, in a pitch black location, that's me looking down at the ground. That's me looking directly forwards. You can sort of make out maybe a little bit of detail in some of the trees there, but certainly as I hold the camera still look, when that frame stacking starts to kick in, you're actually able to make out some of the details in those tree trunks there. But yeah, if I move the camera even just a little bit, those details sort of, they disappear. So this camera needs to be sort of very, very stationary to sort of work the best. Its ability to see in the dark is very impressive. It definitely works best when the camera's stationary though. When there's motion, it doesn't work quite so well. Now, over the last couple of days, I've actually spent quite a lot of time playing around with those night vision goggles. In fact, I've been out pretty much every night this week in the middle of the night, just sort of testing the goggles in various different situations. So in addition to the clips that I've just showed you, I just want to very quickly show you a couple more. Now, this first clip I'm going to show you, this was shot in the woods, and this was done around sort of like half an hour, maybe 45 minutes after sunset. So you're very much sort of in that twilight phase of the night. It was starting to get quite dark. And obviously, because we're in the forest, the canopy of the trees also shielded quite a lot of light. Now, as you can see, on this particular experiment, the camera is able to actually perform very well. You can clearly sort of make out the trees, the bushes, you can very clearly see the path. And I think the reason why the camera sort of did quite well on this occasion is because it was a very overcast night. And this forest was quite close to the city, so a lot of the city's light was being reflected from the clouds back down to the ground, providing just that little bit of illumination. Now, to the eye, it looked very, very dark there. I couldn't see where I was going at all without the aid of a torch. But as you can see, the Infra V2 camera, it could see very well. And I think, if you were flying maybe like a Cinewhoop style quad and you're sort of flying it quite slowly, you'd have no problem flying it through sort of the woods and sort of like following this path at this time of day. Now, in this next clip, This was recorded, I think it's pretty much at midnight. I went to a big park, which is right in the middle of the city. There's no illumination sort of in the park itself, although all around the park, you know, obviously you've got buildings like houses and things. So there was distant illumination coming into the park. And again, it was an overcast night, quite a low cloud. So the city's lights were reflecting off the clouds back down to the ground. And as you can see, you could see absolutely everything absolutely fine. You know, you could clearly, you know, make out the field. You could tell where the ground was, you know, versus the sky. You can make out all the details around the field, like, you know, the buildings, the trees and whatnot. And interestingly, like, there was goalposts in this field, so I went and had a look at them. Now, if you imagine that goalposts were like race gates, like for some reason you want to fly like a race quad, you know, through some gates or something in the middle of the night, this goalpost kind of shows that you'd have absolutely no problem doing that. Now, on the edge of this park, there was a small segregated area, which was like a kids' play park. So I went in there to have a look, and specifically, I had a look at this little small kids climbing frame. And my sort of thinking there was that, you know, if you're ever going to fly like a very small quad, like maybe a tiny whoop or a little bit bigger, because you're not going to be able to fit the Infra on a tiny whoop, but a small, like maybe like a 75 or an 85mm quad, if you're going to sort of fly that slowly and you want to do some sort of proximity, sort of around this kid's climbing frame, you'd have no problem doing that. I mean, as you can see here, you can clearly see every detail in this climbing frame. You can see every little nook and cranny. As long as you weren't flying too fast, I think you'd have no problem sort of flying in and around this kid's climbing frame. Now, on the edge of the kids' play park, there was a little area of some trees. I did just go and have a little look in there because it was very, very shaded in there. Obviously, the canopy of those trees was shielding any light that was coming down from the sky. So it was very, very dark in there. I mean, I absolutely couldn't see anything in there with my eyes. But as you can see, you know, the Infra V2, it could see a fair amount. Certainly could see more than I could see. You can make out the most important things, like where the tree trunks were. And, you know, again, if you're going to fly like a cinewhoop quad sort of around this area, sort of very slowly, I think you'd just about be able to pull that off. Now, this final clip that I want to show you from my experiment with the night vision goggles was filmed in a woods. I think it's about 1 o'clock in the morning. And this is a woods which is sort of, it's in the city. So, you know, around the outside of the woods, there are buildings with, you know, like lights and street lights and things. But crucially, again, it was an overcast night. So the city's lights were reflecting off the clouds back down. Now, as I sort of went down this path and sort of went under the canopy, that's where it was, you know, the peak darkness. It's very, very dark. Again, I couldn't see anything with my eyes. But as you can see, the Infra could actually see pretty well. And it could see better on this occasion than it could, you know, in the clip I showed you a minute ago, where I was testing the camera in the woods on a starlit night. And I think that's the reason why. I think the reason that the camera could see better on this occasion in the woods is because there was that ambient light being reflected down from the clouds. And I think this is probably the most important thing I've learned from my experimentation with the Infra V2 so far, is that, not surprisingly, like, the camera does need a light source. It can't see in absolute pitch black, like, it needs a light source. And it seems to work the best, you know, when it's overcast and you've got light being reflected from the clouds back down to the ground. It probably would also work quite well on a moonlit night, although annoyingly, as you saw, the only time I got to sort of test the camera when the moon was up, the moon was very, very low in the sky. It wasn't really providing very much illumination. I think if you had the moon nice and high in the sky, and if it was like a half moon or a full moon, that would probably work absolutely fantastic. Now, obviously, the Infra V2 is a FPV camera. It's designed to be used on drones. So after I finished playing around with my DIY night vision goggles, I then installed the camera onto one of my drones and I did some aerial testing. Now, in my initial review of the Infra V2 camera, I did install it onto one of my quadcopters, and then I put it up in the air, and I had sort of a look around at the ground, but whilst the quadcopter was basically hovering, it was relatively motionless. But obviously, based on what I said earlier on about the issue with the camera and sort of like motion, I was quite keen to see how well the camera could be used on a drone that's actually moving, as opposed to just hovering. Now, I am mostly a fixed-wing drone pilot. That's mostly what my channel has covered in the past. So I installed the Infra V2 onto one of my flying wings. I installed it onto my Atomar C-Fear flying wing. It's one that's covered in green LEDs. It looks very cool for flying in the night. That's very much what I designed it for. And then, yeah, I went out and I did a couple of flights.
Now, this first flight that I'm showing you, this was filmed on a overcast night. It was done at around sort of midnight down by the coast. It's a reasonably dark location, although there are, it's right on the edge of town, so you've got the city lights there, but over the water it is very dark. Now, annoyingly, as you can see, it was quite turbulent conditions there, so I do apologise that, you know, the footage you're seeing is quite shaky. The aircraft was getting buffeted around. But the important thing that I want you to kind of note is the fact that, you know, you can see quite clearly, you know, especially when I'm sort of flying over this area of the ground here. You can clearly see the ground. More importantly, you can clearly see the trees. You know, you can see sort of details in the terrain with no problem. And, you know, as I was flying around, you know, with a fixed wing, with it being sort of quite high up in the air, not really any obstacles or anything to worry about, this camera performed very, very well. There was no problem using this camera to fly in the night. And yeah, the hardest part of flying a fixed wing at night is the landing, and I had absolutely no problem doing the landing. Now, a couple of days later, I then did a second flight in the exact same location, but on this occasion, it was a completely clear night sky. All the stars are out, but there was no moon. It's done around the sort of the same time of night, around midnight, 1 a.m. And on this occasion, it was a little bit harder to fly. So as you can see here, sort of as I fly over sort of this, the ground here, the ground is now appearing very, very dark, and it's very hard to make out details such as sort of trees or any sort of like terrain features. And yeah, I think it's basically because the camera wasn't receiving sort of much light from the sky to illuminate the ground. So the ground was appearing sort of very dark. And then obviously with all of the city lights around, that was kind of messing up the exposure and the wide dynamic range a little bit. So yeah. Kind of the same as what I said a few minutes ago. I think this camera, it works best when you've got some illumination in the sky. You know, if it's the full moon or half moon, that would work really well. Or if it's like light reflecting off of the clouds from the city, that would work very well. But on a completely like starlit sky with no sort of illumination coming down, as you can see, I did struggle. But I did manage to fly the aircraft. You know, and that's probably the most important thing to sort of take away from this. You know, I did manage to fly in the dark with no problem. And crucially, I managed to land the aircraft with no problem. Now, I did do a third flight, which I just want to mention to you. So at the very beginning of this video, I tested the camera in the day, and I wanted to see what the camera is like to use on a drone in the day. So I also did a flight with my Fear in the middle of the afternoon. I think it's about like 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a bright sunny day. And yeah, again, it worked. I was able to sort of fly around without too much issue. But as you can see, that overexposure issue you get on a bright day, you know, especially when the sun's in the sky, it did make it a little bit tricky, especially when flying in the direction of the sun. Because it wasn't just the sky that sort of was appearing overexposed, but also some of the ground details, like these little trees and flying around. Obviously, the sunlight was reflecting off of them, and then they were appearing overexposed as well. So in this clip, I was trying to do a little bit of proximity flying around the trees, but I didn't really feel confident enough to do that because I couldn't really see very clearly. So yeah, that's basically all of the footage that I have to show you. So now it's time for me to do a bit of a conclusion. I think the first thing I want to say is that the Infra V2, I think it's definitely an upgrade over the Infra V1. Its ability to see in the dark is definitely a little bit improved. I think Caddx advertised it as having an improvement of around 30%. I'd say that seems sort of roughly about right. It's not like a night and day improvement, pun intended, but it's definitely improved. You know, you're definitely going to have a better experience of being able to see in the dark with the Infra V2 versus the Infra V1. And it's also worth mentioning as well that the Infra V2, it's a smaller camera. The little AI box is smaller. So, you know, if saving weight on your aircraft is important, that's another reason to go for the Infra V2. Now, when it comes to deciding whether you want to buy this camera for yourself, I think there's basically one thing you need to take into consideration, and that is what kind of flying are you planning to do? If you want to sort of like fly like a 5-inch race quad, you want to do fast flying, maybe do proximity and stuff, I don't think this camera is going to be much good for you, because as we sort of saw earlier on, the camera suffers with quite a lot of like motion blur and streaking when the camera's moving quickly, and I think the image you'd end up getting in the goggles wouldn't be very usable. If, however, you wanted to fly like maybe like a cinewhoop, and you want to do sort of like some nice, slow, smooth flying, I think, you know, the camera could work very well for that. And, you know, if you're like me, a fixed wing pilot, and, you know, you're not planning on flying low, you want to sort of, you know, fly up higher where you haven't really got to sort of worry with obstacles, I think the camera would work very well for you. You know, as long as you've got just that little bit of illumination, maybe from like the moon or from the clouds coming down, you know, you're going to get a very, very good image. And I think the camera would be very good for that. So yeah,
ultimately, I am very, very impressed with the Infra V2. I think it's definitely an upgrade over the Infra V1, and I would, without hesitation, say that the Infra V2 is now the best night vision FPV camera that I've ever used. It's certainly going to be the one that I use on any future projects where I need a night vision camera, especially when you take into account the price as well. It's actually cheaper than the original Infra V1. So I think it's definitely, it's a no-brainer. You know, if you want a night vision FPV camera, this is the one to get. Anyway, that's basically everything that I've got to say for today's video. But I hope that you found this little review interesting and sort of helpful. If you have, please do give the video a like down below. And yeah, I guess I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers, guys. Bye.